Okay, here we go. Well, welcome everyone for joining us for this launch of our new recovered book, Spoiler House Press edition of Time Stood Still by Paul Cohen-Portheim. And with us, we're very delighted today to have the two other contributors to our reissue of this book, Andrea Pitzer and Panikos Panayi, who are, as I was talking with them just before we started, they're some of the few people I know actually read this book before we came out with our new edition of it. So I was very happy to have their support in bringing this edition out. I'm going to start with a few comments about Paul Cohen-Portheim to give you a little background on him, because he is a complex character. Although I think we all agree this is an amazing book, he himself has issues that we need to be aware of in today's world. And then I'm going to ask Panikos to talk a little bit about the context of the book within the context of internment of German civilians and internment of non-combatants during World War I, which was kind of like, it wasn't the first time that happened, but it really became a widespread state policy. And then finally, we're going to have some comments from Andrea Pitzer, who talked about this whole issue and the history of concentration camps and internment camps in her book, One Long Night, A Global History of the Concentration Camp. So let me start by just sharing a few slides here to talk about. So yes, we're launching this book. It came out on the 30th of November, and hopefully folks are finding it easy to get copies through whatever retail arrangement you prefer. So Andrea has got 3 books, and I know she's working on another, and actually you're sort of stymied. Are you still stuck in terms of making a return trip to the Arctic?
Yeah, the Russian Arctic is not really the place for an American to go at this moment. So.
Oh, well. Well, we're looking forward to it, because believe me, I've read all of her books, and they're terrific. They're page turners, they're mind openers, and that's, I mean, those are the things you ask for in a nonfiction book, I think. And Panikos has got quite a list. This is just a sample. I wanted to highlight that he's a very versatile writer. So on the one hand, we see his books that deal specifically with this issue that Time Stood Still, which is about internment of civilians and prisoners of other types during World War I. But he's also written a number of more popular books, including some food history books, which I love. And if you've ever been to the UK, I can highly recommend Fish and Chips, because you will learn much about that still ubiquitous, although I have to say, you know, it's harder and harder to get fish and chips in London. There's just that one place in near Covent Garden, the Rock and Soul place. Really, I don't know where else you would get it in London. Although, you know, my wife and I lived in Norwich, and of course there were a number of really good places there that to get it. So Paul Cohen, go ahead.
Sorry, in central London it's an issue. Outside central London it's fine.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know. That's institutions being preserved. So Paul Cohen-Portheim, an interesting, he's sort of, in some ways, sort of like an archetypical Central European. I was writing about another writer who's being slowly rediscovered now, Rosemary Tonks, and in every one of Tonks's novels, she has these ambiguously Central European characters who seem to be German, or, I mean, Paul Cohen-Portheim is variously described as German, as Austrian. He was fluent in French. He lived in Paris for many years. He actually was born in Berlin. He was of a Jewish family. And he was very artistic. Originally, he actually found himself in England because he was working, he was painting. He was just on a holiday painting in England. And the war broke out and he got stuck. And as he tells the story, eventually goes from simply being kind of unrooted and idling his time to actually being interned first in Knockalow on the Isle of Man, and then at Loft House, which is where he spent most of his time. So this was the first camp he was put into, Knockalow on the Isle of Man, and this is sort of commemorated now. And there is a fair amount of information. In fact, there's a nice website about Knockalow if you're interested in knowing more about that camp. And then he was shifted to Loft House Park, which is a former, I think it was a former racetrack that was taken over and made into this internment camp. And it was considered the gentleman's camp. They wore their clothes, they gardened, they pursued hobbies, so they weren't physically tortured. But I think one of the powerful things about this book is how convincingly Cohen-Portheim conveys essentially the inhumanity of taking people and putting them in any place with literally nothing to do and nowhere to go, and particularly they had no idea how long this is going to last. That's one of the points that I think David McCullough used to make this when he'd talk about writing history, which is the people who are there don't know how things are going to turn out. So, and it's our nature in most cases to imagine the worst. So here he is in this place, and he is just seeing one day pass to another, and he does give us such a vivid account of all the little things. One of the passages I quoted when I first wrote about the book was how he notices how day in, day out, how maddening hearing someone slurping soup off of their spoon day in and day out can be. It was interesting, after he came out of internment, he was released, and he had some time that's described in the book in the Netherlands until the end of the war. And then he became a writer, which he was not really doing much of before. At least I haven't seen any evidence that he was a writer before his time in the camp. And his first book was published in German. Most of his books were actually written in German. Time Stood Still, I think, is about the only one that he wrote in English. The rest of them were translated. So his first book was really in German. I guess it's Asia as a Teacher or as an Educator. It came out after he died as Message from Asia. And it's sort of, it's interesting to know about this book, because he's very open towards the wisdom of the East, as we might put it. Whereas later on, he writes some things that are probably, I'll show you an example of one of the things he wrote that it does put your teeth on edge. He wrote a number of travel books. So this is one, Spirit of Paris, a beautiful, the original cover was painted by Cecil Beaton. And he also wrote one called The Spirit of London, a little, not a Cecil Beaton cover. But he also, as time went on, became kind of convinced of some theories that that probably don't sit that well with us today. And so this is something he wrote for the Sphere in 1931, where he says, and I quote this, the British Empire today is a necessity to England. Its importance for Europe lies in the fact it is a champion of the world supremacy of the white man. And, it's ironic, we're just a few years after his death, after he wrote this, of course, he would have been considered a persona non grata in Germany, his own native country. And in fact, we were about to see all the horrors of the Holocaust. So, this kind of mentality was certainly used for very bad purposes. And it's a little distressing to see that that's kind of where his mind went towards the end of his life. He died within a year of writing that, or a year or so. So he died in 1932. He had actually gone down to Portugal because he was in ill health, and apparently something happened. He was hospitalized, and his doctor in Portugal recommended he go back to his home in Paris to recover, which he did. And then within a few days of returning to Paris, he died in 1932. It was recorded. Actually, his books did very well, comparatively well in both the UK and the US. So this is from a newspaper in Alabama, of all places. So this is, the wire services put out the news of his death, and it was, pretty widely publicized. But from that point on, most of his works have kind of fallen out of print, and Time Stood Still was one of the quickest ones to become unavailable. So with that, I want to turn over for a moment to Panikos to talk a little bit about, give us an idea, how many German nationals were interned by the British during World War I? What are we talking about in terms of rough numbers?
It depends whether you're looking at, so most of them are interned in Great Britain, and then there's so maybe 30 to 40,000, and then another 10,000 to 20,000 outside, so in other parts of the British Empire. And so if I put it into wider context, so I think when I first worked on this many years ago, it was my PhD thesis, The Enemy in Our Midst, which you saw earlier, Germans in Britain during the First World War. I concentrated on Great Britain, and basically the story of internment was one of the many ways in which German nationals who lived in Great Britain when the First World War broke out were disenfranchised, for want of a better phrase. So there were all sorts of, so there was a very Germanophobic atmosphere. The property of Germans was confiscated. At the same time, all sorts of legislation was introduced to prevent the movement of Germans, and one of the other key, so it was getting rid of their property, confiscating their property, preventing movement, and all sorts of other measures. It was the Aliens Restriction Act, which also prevented them from changing their names, from becoming naturalized. And then the third element of the disenfranchisement, if you like, of the Germans was internment. But since I've worked on that, initially I assumed that the Germans who were interned were all living in Great Britain. There was 53,000 Germans, depending on how you count them, who lived in Great Britain when the First World War broke out. But the people who are interned aren't just those people. And the government. So there's three types of people who are in, three types of Germans who are interned. If we deal with the other two groups first, the first group is actually the British Empire. Well, okay, you've just given us this quote from Cohen-Portheim about the British white man controlling the world, and this comes through in internment. So if you are a German who was on a ship crossing the Atlantic, either way, or even if you're a German in the Pacific, somehow, if your ship was intercepted by a Royal Naval ship, then you would be taken to the nearest place of British control, the nearest British territory, and interned. So let's just stick with the example of crossing the Atlantic. You were escorted your ship was escorted, let's say, to Cornwall, and then you were taken off the boat, and then you might spend the next 4 years in internment camps. It could be in one internment camp, it could be in a series of internment camps. And as you said, well, the main one is Knockalo, which I'll touch on in a minute. The second way is like Cohen-Portheim. So Cohen-Portheim is quite interesting because he's just passing through in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he's probably maybe the smallest of the three groups who's interned. He's just unlucky to have been in Britain, or where he was painting on the south coast of England, which he said he did every summer. And when the First World War breaks out, he's not initially interned, and then he says he receives a knock on the door in May 1915 when wholesale internment is decided by the British government, and he's told. He asked the policeman, "How should I prepare?" And the policeman says, "You should prepare as if you were going on holiday." And then he comments, "It turned out to be a very long holiday." And so the long holiday lasted until 1918. And then the third group is the long-term British German residents in Britain, who are lower middle class and middle class. So one of the most important jobs is waiters. So if you went to buy a meal in a London restaurant, let's say in 1911, there was a big chance that you'd be served by German waiters. They also owned bakers shops, butcher shops, and barbers. So they were the three of the most important. So I guess the other thing to say here, which is really important, it was males who were interned. So it was males of military age, 17 to 45 or 17 to 55, depending on what the government have decided at the time. So it varied. So women, only a handful of women in World War One were interned by the British government. And at the end of the war, there was a process of which I'm very happy to describe as ethnic cleansing of the Germans. I mean, I think there seems to be this sensitivity amongst a lot of historians that the British don't do ethnic cleansing. I mean, I'd probably argue they might even have invented it. But anyway, that's a subject for another day. But I mean, the population of Germans goes from 53,000 census of 1911 to 19,000 because they're deported. So I think that phrase works quite well. So just, the final point would be about the camp system. So the headquarters of the camp system is Knockalo on the Isle of Man. So that holds a maximum of about 23,000 prisoners. Wow. So you had that picture, and I guess you have to imagine 23,000 men in this space at its height. I mean, it varies during its existence, and then so that was opened at the end of 1914, and it was regarded as the main camp. It was the main. So it's not just Germans in Britain; it's Germans brought from all over the world in this camp, and then. When the war broke out, initially the government couldn't make up its mind, so there were temporary camps, and then you also have another group of long-term camps. So if we just focus on Britain, it was not Lofthouse Park, which was which is in Yorkshire near Wakefield, and that lasted for about 3 years, and Alexandra Palace in North London was another long-term one. And then there was also this issue of some camps housed civilian internees, and then the other group, which I haven't looked at, there's also military prisoners who were brought in from the Western Front, and there's some camps are initially civilian camps and then become military camps. So in a sense, I guess Cohen-Portheim's experience just reflects the lives of the German community in Britain. And I just to finish, I mean, I discovered very many, when I was doing my PhD, and it's sort of stuck with me since that time. And whenever I come back to this theme, Cohen-Portheim's, I mean, I can remember some of his sentences going back, all those years from the 1980s when when I did my PhD. So I think he speaks for all Germans interned in Britain in the First World War. I guess just one final quality. I mean, he's highly educated. Most of the Germans who end up in internment aren't highly educated, and maybe they wouldn't have had the ability to write, a text like this, and they may have been more used to, if they were waiters, they would have been had more experience of less space, of sharing accommodation. But then on the other hand, a lot of the other themes he brings out, about the uncertainty of internment, the date of internment. That he speaks for all Germans in who are interned in the First World War, I would say.
Can I ask, you get the impression from his book that the government came up with these camps and came up with the idea of internment sort of after the war broke out as a reactive kind of measure, that it took them a while to say, oh, this is, even though, as we know from Andrea's book and of course all other accounts, that they had experience from the Boer War of internment. Is that something that in World War II they turned around and kind of did automatically?
Well, when the Second World War breaks out, they had actually planned for internment, so they had plans to undertake it, and then, but it's equally confusing. Well, it's what they do is they divide Germans and Italians when the Second World War breaks out into three groups of according to their threat. So the most threatening, I think, is Group A. And so they're interned straight away, but then nothing very much happens until 1940 when the Nazis have taken over most of Western Europe, the fall of France in June 1940, and the declaration of war by Italy in Britain. And there's a sort of mass internment, but that's sort of quickly withdrawn within. So most people who are interned in June 1940 are released quite quickly. A lot of them are German Jewish refugees, so the government realizes its error quite quickly. Some of them are deported to North America, and you have the Arendora Star, this ship which is deporting people to America, and then is sunk, so a lot of Italians are killed. But I mean, the answer to your question is they have plans, but it is, I guess, policy on the hoof is the phrase that we're looking for. So that it happens in World War II in the same way as it does in World War I. I think the main difference between World War I and World War II is that in World War I, these poor Germans spend the whole war, because there's not this process of sifting people out, and so it's a far lengthier process than it was in World War II. So in World War II, it's mostly people who are regarded as a threat. So Nazis in particular are the ones who spend the whole war behind barbed wire.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. That really, to me, it helps. Andrea, sorry. Let me switch to you to talk about, you've written about, as you put it in the title of your book, the global history of concentration camps. So how does this, how did you come across this book, and where does this fit in the whole scheme of interning civilians as a state policy?
So I came across this book in 2008. And I was working on my Nabokov book. And in the Nabokov book, camps come up again and again and again. And he actually, in one of his novels, has a man who was exiled in Russia during as a foreigner during World War I, and is effectively held in, there was a kind of remote exile that was not a formal camp the way we think of it, but many, many people were dislocated who were enemy aliens. And this man was there, and he went almost insane. He said he read like 1,018 books. And if he hadn't had those books to read, he would have gone mad. And the answer is, in the novel, he actually has gone mad. But I was like, hadn't really thought about all these people during World War I. I knew about World War I internment. So I went looking for a history of this, and I couldn't really find it. And so I decided, after I wrote the Nabokov book, maybe there needed to be an idea concept book of how did mass civilian detention on the basis of identity without trial kind of come into the world, and how do we get to a place like Auschwitz? Nabokov's brother had been held in World War II as a homosexual, and so there were just camps kept coming up again and again. So I was doing an archive search in the New York Times archive on internment and concentration camps, and of course that term concentration camp is often what was used for these camps, although we now think of it as something much more horrific. I'll talk a little about that in a second. But I did archive searches for it, and I came across the review for Time Stood Still. And I thought, oh, that looks really wonderful. I should get that book. And I was still working on the Nabokov book, but I did get a copy of it, which I'm glad, because it became quite difficult, which is one of the reasons you're bringing it back into print, but it became quite difficult to find it.
Yeah.
So I was glad that I had a copy of it. And in reading it, I found that he had so much insight and he had so much deep empathy. He was very open about his sort of privileged nature, and even comic, even makes fun of himself for wearing the white suit that he packed because he was told that he was going on holiday, that he was going to wear this completely inappropriate attire, but as an assertion of the self. And I think that that's a really sort of wonderful way. As we know from sort of what he became later, perhaps it wasn't entirely only, he was perhaps asserting some aspects of his superiority, but he's very conscious of his privilege. And he, in this book, still has this very deep empathy and for all the different prisoners that he encounters, and he has these incredible insights. And I wanted to write about global internment when I did turn to the concentration camp book. I wanted to write about it during this period. I only have 3.5 languages, and this was really a global phenomenon. So I went to the international headquarters of the Red Cross in Geneva, and French is one of my languages, and it was the diplomatic language of the time. So they had a policy at that point where they put everything in French. It would come in one language, and it would be translated into French. And for the languages I knew, the translations were pretty good, at least the ones I ran across. So I read it was an endless amount of material. The number of people were held. The Red Cross visited more than 500 camps in 38 at least countries. It was really, as you said, this global phenomenon in that moment, which was incredible. Well, 38 things that would become countries or were colonial territories at that point, I should clarify. And out of all of those photos and descriptions by third persons and logs written in first person from people they had spoken with, the Cohen-Portheim book was the one I felt had sort of the most historical insight, even though he himself doesn't actually know a lot about what came before or what came after. The observations he made about his life in the camp were very, very telling. And so for each of the chapters, I tried to use one internee in a given system to sort of provide the narrative, while I'm also putting in these larger historical ideas of how many people, how many places around the world, and all this. So I used his book as the background story for that chapter War I internment. And the thing was that, he had also, and I think Panikos mentioned this in his addition to this reissue, that one of the things that's great about this narrative is it starts before he's interned. And we see the daily life devolve in England. This sinking of the Lusitania, I don't think we've mentioned here, but that was a really critical moment because internment started before that. They had rounded up people who were suspects. So all along the stage, they were interning people, but there was this tremendous public pressure to intern everybody that had been born in Austria, born in Germany. And there was really a lot of resistance to it, which I think is pretty honorable in retrospect. There were people in government who said, this is not necessary. Maybe Panikos will remember, I'm forgetting who it was in this moment, but one of the ministers brought before Parliament and interrogated, why aren't you locking everybody up? We should lock everybody up. He basically says, for the German baker that's been here for 30 years, there's no more danger than from your average British criminal. I mean, which was kind of a shocking thing to say in that moment, because in the same era, you have people literally asking in published opinion pieces, do Germans have souls? Which is also incredible to realize from this historical moment. But when that passenger liner is sunk by a German U-boat, then there is sort of the government ends up falling. I mean, I'm not linking the two there's many things going
Right,
on in this. There's a lot of moving parts, but you have this pressure that no longer has the pressure back against it. And you have a whole additional swath of people that are interned. And Cohen-Portheim tells us this, like from the beginning of his experience being there. And you can sort of see what's happening in the society as restrictions are heavier and heavier. He is completely oblivious to most of this and finds it out kind of in shocking ways. And so it's very capturing and almost entertaining in a strange way. He's the naive guy, right, who's swept up in this historical moment. And then he also talks about what happens after he's released, and things like people couldn't walk in a straight line on the street because they had been so accustomed to walking the length of the camp and then having to turn and turn, that this idea of just like forward motion without restriction is psychologically traumatizing or has to be navigated. And so I also really like that we had the larger story. It wasn't just what happened inside the camp, but it was also what that meant when they went back into society, which was a really critical part of it. And I also think a key thing for why the book was so valuable for me was that he understood that he had suffered a lot less than everybody else. And he says in the book that he actually like improved himself, that it made it into a positive experience and all that. But I think when, at least for myself, when I'm reading that book, I'm very dubious of this still, even though he managed to come out and make a great life for himself. The things he even says about how he felt, it was obviously a deeply traumatic experience, even though he makes something quite positive out of it, becomes a writer, becomes very introspective and all these other things. But he didn't know that for his own good fortune, I want to read this one quote from him here, that he quote, his own good fortune, quote, must not prevent me from considering a disease, nor induce my readers to think that what I call good, I blew that whole thing. Let me start over. It must not prevent me from considering a disease, nor induce my readers to think that I call a good what in itself is evil. And that was really telling to me. He is seeing World War II has not happened, Nazi camps, Gulag, none of that has happened yet. And he is seeing to the heart of the dangerous, not just potential of what camps can become, but in their best form. Like this was about as good as concentration camps got. And it was harrowing, right? It destroyed everybody. He says, other than himself, he didn't know anybody else that hadn't been deeply affected and harmed by their experience. And I thought that was, I didn't want to cherry pick only stories that I agreed with. I tried to bring in a lot of different kinds of stories into my book, but I thought that was such an insightful and amazing conclusion for him to reach, given that he couldn't have the hindsight that we now have. He couldn't have the foresight, in other words, to see into the future. And so to put it into the historical context, and I don't want to take all our time, I know there's going to be questions and stuff, but the influence of the World War camps in history, it is enormous. It cannot be overstated. Before that, camps were used predominantly in colonial settings. The best known ones probably would be the British ones, but also Spanish, Germans, Americans in the Philippines. They were seen as barbaric. They were seen as a last resort tool when they weren't even necessarily applied that way, which one could argue that perhaps they weren't at some points in the Second World War. They degenerated into that. The numbers of women and children that died far outpaced combatants frequently. They were seen as horrific. What World War I did was to normalize them. It rehabilitated the concept. It made it palatable. There was a whole bureaucracy because it was the British Empire, of course. When Britain decided to do it, it was done around the globe. And then other countries were doing it in retaliation. Germany had some colonial holdings at that time, although not after World War I, of course. And so what you saw was it was the globalization of what had been a controlled sort of wartime phenomenon. And it became incredibly normal. It was great that the Red Cross went in and observed these, and yet it also made it seem like they weren't so bad. Yeah, it was great that there were lending libraries, but of course it also made it seem like conditions there weren't so bad. And so what you get is that after World War I, camps continue. And each country has its own culture and history and dynamics, that it folds this globalized idea of locking up civilians preemptively with. And so it's sort of like, I think of it as the colonial camps as kind of the root of the tree, and the trunk of the tree is these World War I camps. And then, of course, they flare out wildly into these different branches that go many different directions. But you were talking, Panikos, about the British intercepting people at sea. And one of the people the British intercepted who wasn't even an enemy alien was Leon Trotsky. And they put him in a Canadian internment camp. And then he comes out, he writes this diatribe against concentration camps. It's like, this is what democracy gets you. Concentration camp. Look how I was treated. I wasn't even an enemy alien. It becomes mandatory reading for the Red Army, his pamphlet on his internment. And of course, they immediately start using it in the Russian Civil War. Right. The British use some of the laws, some of the things for Irish, during the Irish War of Independence. You see this kind of internment. The first camps that the Russian Civil War have go into the Gulag. And so we think of these horrific systems, but really these camps were normalized all over the world. You had homeless, you had vagrants, and they were called concentration camps. Just let me be clear at this time. And they were used in Europe, in North America, in South America for undesirable civilian populations that you could just move them to the side, lock them up, and that was somehow acceptable. The Tulsa Race Massacre, which many people have learned about in recent years because of television and other things, they were used then. The surviving members of this Tulsa community, this Black community that was so traumatized by having their neighborhood destroyed that day, were locked up in a theater, which was called a concentration camp by newspapers in that era. And until Black people were missing from white households and not doing their servant chores, they were locked there. Then it became all right. White people could come and vouch for them and bring them out. But I don't want to, it can't be overstated how influential these World War I camps were. But then, of course, we get to the Gulag itself. We get to the Nazi camps. We get to the most horrific iterations. We see the emergence of death camps, which we now imagine as what concentration camps are, but they really had this long history before. But I don't think you can get to those Nazi camps without a tradition of people turning in when they're told to report themselves. When they get a prisoner number, they wait out their time as a national pariah in detention until this conflict, until this social stress is ended. And the lesson from World War I was, and they would be released. Almost everyone, not everyone, but almost everyone made it out of the camps that went in to those World War I camps. And of course, in World War II, it was a very, very different result. But the social training and the social global response to those early Nazi camps, again, pre-death camps, was a much more confused reaction, I think, because of that World War I template that people had in mind. So all of that is to say they were hugely, hugely influential. And I think that Paul Cohen-Portheim could not have imagined the twisted forms that the camps would take on later and targeting people even like himself. But in Time Stood Still, I think he gets to the essential nature of what is inhumane and wrong about this whole category of detention.
Right. Thank you for that. One of the things I find really remarkable about the book is that unlike so many, memoirs, it's almost as if he was a trained sociologist. His way of describing the system of the camps that he was in, and analyzing the personalities and the cultures and the routines and all those things. It is, it's not just here's my personal reaction to this. He really does try to put it into as much of a context and to kind of approach it from a logical, each chapter kind of has a theme once he's in the camp. And that's, that's to me, that's one of the extraordinary things about this book that makes it such a remarkable resource. Is it's not just his personal experience. He is really trying to say, I need to capture this as a phenomenon that needs to be described to other people.
And I think that it feels to me in reading the book, it appears to me that he went out of his way to include people who obviously should never have been put in the camps, to make clear that there were many errors, not just in judgment, but in bureaucracy, that things that were promised didn't happen. He even gives the dimensions allocated again for each person. So there is almost an ethnography of the camps that's happening from somebody who's beautifully fluent in English and a really good writer, and feels very wronged about what happened to him and these other people. But he really, I think the magic of what he's doing, and I don't know how you turn into the superiority of the white guy stuff later from this deep understanding he has in that moment, and writing about it more than a decade later to see he would back up and say, but people were trying to do good this way, or they thought it would be a favor this way. He's giving so much credit to the people who are actually trying to make some kind of a difference, even when it doesn't work. He could have written a much more condemning book. He could have written a much more fire and brimstone kind of book, but he clearly set about to do something else. And I just don't know if what we see him doing is exactly what he was thinking he was doing, or if it's just that there was just a beautiful felicity and synchronicity of all of it.
Right. Absolutely. That's a good point. Well, let's open it up. We haven't got a huge audience here, but if there's anyone who wants to chime in, just raise your hand or type in a message in the chat. I wanted to ask while we're waiting for questions, Panikos, talk about how you came across the book. I mean, you were working on your PhD, but I mean, you just happened to go along the shelf and pick out a book and discovered it, or did you know what you were looking for?
I'm not sure. Well, I'm not sure I can remember exactly how I discovered it. I mean, I remember one of the few pieces of work that had emerged at that time was by someone called Caesar Arensfeld, and he wrote an article about German Jewish enemy aliens in World War I Britain, and I wonder if I found it from there. And there must have been, I think before we came on there must have been a copy in the British Library. But I wasn't. You couldn't really make a whole photocopy in the British Library at that time, so I could do it in.
You can't
in
now
LSE.
either, but
no, you can't now.
But I've heard that people do it.
So have I. But in this strange annex in the in the London School of Economics library, which no longer exists, there was a copy, and so I grabbed a copy and found a photocopier in the LSE library and managed to do the whole photocopy. And what I intended to do, so I went to Germany to do a research trip, and I wanted to contact a publisher in 1987 to reissue the book, and then I never got around to it. So when you contacted me, as you remember the email, do you want to do this? In 1 second after I got the email, yes, because it was sort of something I'd wanted to do 35 years previously.
Well, and I should say, Brad,
so glad that
Brad,
you did.
I want to give you credit before we move on, which was that when I actually turned to writing the camps book and I had this copy of this, I was reading and I was like, this is an amazing book. Why isn't there more? And I looked online and there was the Neglected Books review of it. So you were the first thing, your review of this book was the first thing I found online while I was reading it, saying, why aren't more people talking about this? So,
wow, that's great.
So I don't know what year you wrote that, but.
It was probably around 2007 or 8. It was one of the earlier books that I wrote about, I think. I started the site in 2000. I mean, I've been reading and looking for these books for decades, but I started the site in 2006. And and I've been keeping at it. And yeah, I mean, it's never been issued in Germany, has it?
Not that I know of.
I wouldn't.
Yeah, let's hope. We're starting to see a little synergy on some of the books that we've reissued are being picked up by foreign presses and translated. Our first book, Gentlemen Overboard, has done phenomenal. We've now editions have come out in, I think, soon to be 9 or 10 different like Arab. There's an Arabic translation.
Wow.
Due out soon. So there are, I mean, there's this sort of informal network. So I hope it does get picked up, partly because, I mean, we have internment camps with us today.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to touch on a little bit, was that like, first of all, that idea of do Germans have souls, which was a legitimate topic. And there were stories of German soldiers impaling babies on, on their bayonets. And I mean, there were these dramatic stories, and there was plenty of horrific violence that was happening in World War I. Absolutely. But the way these stories were sort of curated and assembled, there was a narrative of making the opponent evil in that war, in a way, using propaganda in ways that had just become sophisticated in recent decades. And I think it's something that, like camps, we've really seen stick with us in unfortunate ways. And so I would really want to encourage people that the roots of this idea are, when you say some group of people, by nature of being members of that group, are irredeemably evil, are irredeemably dangerous, cannot assimilate, et cetera, that is the root of concentration camps. Something has to be moved outside of society and isolated in some way, right? And unfortunately, it's how we have the Rohingya camps, we have Uyghur camps, we have the border detention that's happening in India, we have border detention in the US. This is not a phenomenon that has left us, but we just don't call it concentration camps as freely as we used to, which should be good, but has the down. I mean, Auschwitz should be the first thing we think of when we think of camps. Absolutely. And at the same time, how they got there is the other part we should keep in mind. And I think that's one of the valuable additions of this book, because we clearly we've learned the Auschwitz lesson, that is to be memorialized and feared, but we haven't learned the lesson of the dangers of what comes before it, right? And I think we're very much, we have much worse camps than anything Paul Cohen-Portheim was in a number of places around the world today.
Yeah, absolutely. But even the kinder camps, I mean, that's part of what this book shows is, the the torturous aspects of just the fact that this is not how human beings are supposed to live. That we put them, and and that's what isn't, I don't think we hear enough of is, we have Syrian internment camps, we have internment camps here on our border. The UK has internment camps right now for people who have struggled to get across the channel, and we don't what we don't hear enough of is essentially the voice of, okay, so I mean, how long are people spending in these camps? And I mean, we know the horrible stories we heard a few years ago with the children being separated from their families here in our own border internment camps. The fact that isn't kinder, because we're not shoveling them into ovens, or we're not beating them or working them to death like a place like Mott and it's not kinder. It is a pretty terrible thing for states to be doing. And also the evidence is that it's not necessarily effective in the fundamental aim to which it's trying to achieve in the first place.
Usually the governments that institute this kind of detention are doing it for political ends and out of some kind of desperation. I mean, it isn't just, it's not sound policy. And I mean, it doesn't usually carry out. It's usually an attempt by a government to keep or garner power, like from the most, what we would call anodyne forms to the most serious forms. But the problem with having even these lower key better forms is that it takes very little for them to be transformed into something much worse. And I think of the French camps in southern France on the Spanish border in the 30s, and with Spain in the Spanish Civil War, when Franco's forces started gaining momentum, you had hundreds of thousands of people in a very brief period of time fleeing across that border. The French were already very politically unstable at that moment. They did not want, the more conservative members of government did not want all of these very far left radicals pouring into their cities in that moment. And so what they did was they isolated them out in the middle of nowhere in what turned out to be horrific conditions. So not trying to kill them off, not any of those things, but people got extremely sick. Well, then the camps stayed open. The war starts. So then they become enemy alien camps. And there's a huge number of Jews fleeing Germany that end up prisoners in France when, at the end of this sort of Franco era of the camps, then they become these enemy alien camps. France falls. The Germans have access and control to it. And then people are shipped directly from these camps, often through Paris and Drancy.
Right.
And so the possibility of these camps, they're never static, right? What are they in this moment? Doesn't it all say what will they become? And so the longer we keep them in the world, I think the more dangerous.
Cohen-Portheim would have ended up in one of those French camps, undoubtedly, if he'd lived, because he would have been resident as a enemy alien in France too. I mean, that seems to be where he had settled after leaving England. So, a comment in the chat about how he writes about time itself being the arch enemy and needing to be killed. Is this in keeping with accounts of internment elsewhere? I have to defer to Andrea.
I think it's one thing we haven't spoken about is well, sorry, I've got the book in front. So he uses one of his chapters is called barbed wire air, and then another one, barbed wire sickness. So there was this concept of barbed wire sickness, and so there were various causes. So there was an account by a psychologist, Adolf Lucas Fischer, about barbed wire disease, and so it was a more scientific. Well, I mean, it's scientific, and it has different perspectives from Cohen-Portheim. But one of the reasons that Fisher gives for barbed wire sickness, because the barbed wire is the symbol of your psychosis as an internee in the First World War. And one of the things that causes barbed wire sickness is you don't know about the end of your sentence. And I think Cohen-Portheim actually uses that phrase. So it does come up in other accounts, and especially the barbed wire sickness account by Fisher. I mean, there's all sorts of other reasons which are given for this psychosis, if you like, separation from your family, not working is, that's key to Cohen-Portheim. So he has to develop all these he can carry on with his paintings, but then he describes how difficult it is to do that because of the space confinement. So his is the literary account, and then there's also this very scientific account by Fisher.
And it's interesting that it was picked up that quickly. That I was not aware of Fisher's research, and that it came out. So, it was right then and right as it was happening, almost it was being identified as a pathology.
Yeah, I don't think he quite coins the phrase. I've come across it from as early as 1916, the idea of barbed wire sickness in sort of writings of Germans who were interned in other camps, even military prisoners, actually. But it does, he popularizes it, and actually he bases his research. So the reason he knows about it is because he's a Swiss camp inspector. So because there's diplomatic relations break off between Britain and Germany, you have the intermediary state, which at the end of initially it was the USA, and then when the USA joins the war, it's Switzerland. So he's acting on behalf of the German government. He makes numerous visits, especially to Nokelo, and that's where he develops all his ideas, because he sort of observes the wretchedness of their position and their depression. You remember he talks about gambling, as another way of killing time, and he's very condemnatory of this. But yeah, so it surfaces in about 1916, and then at the end of the war, he publishes his book, and it sort of formalizes it, if you like. Although, whether it's purely scientific or not has been open to debate, I think.
Right.
I think that the one of the sort of cleverest things that Cohen-Portheim does is that, first it's a holiday, then he thinks they're talking the war is going to wrap up. I forget what it's like, maybe in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It can't possibly go, then it can't possibly go past winter. And it's sort of this moving the goalpost again and again and again, where you experience it a little bit like they do, where it's like, we know, of course, how long it's going to last, but seeing what they imagined as those endpoints is just really moving. And I think the barbed wire is also a critical part. It didn't get patented and in mass distribution until like the 1870s, 1890s. And so this, it really was part of the global thing that became part of the camps. You could hold a lot of people with automatic weapons and barbed wire in ways that they weren't possible to hold before. And I think that new kind of detention was recognized very quickly by Vischer and by others, that this produced a different effect on people than other just living in a village where somebody might tell you can't leave feels quite different than that kind of camp setting.
Right. Yeah. So it's a byproduct of the industrial age in some ways. Yeah. Okay. I don't see any other questions or comments in the chat. So let's go ahead and wrap up. Any last comments that either one of you would like to make about the book? I have been told that there is a review coming out in the Times sometime within the next week. So that would be great to get some exposure to this book, because I think it is, it really should, in my mind, and I'm biased, of course, but I think it should be it should be one of those classics that just stays in print and gets widely read and studied, because it's a phenomenal text in my mind.
I mean, yeah, everybody, if you have anyone on the call, if you haven't read it, you should definitely get a copy and read it. I think it's a way to understand much of the 20th century from a view you probably haven't thought about it before.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the only last word I'd like to say is I'm really grateful that you brought it out again, because it is, such a deeply analytical and important text in, enabling us to understand incarceration.
Well, my goal for this series is really just to bring terrific, important books back into print so people can get at them, because the one thing that I've learned when I went back to grad school was that, really once it's out of print, and particularly if it's scarce, it's a cliff function. People no longer even look for it. And it becomes, that's really when it becomes forgotten. So simply having it, available for one-click ordering or however you want to purchase it, makes such a huge difference in a text being accessible and being integrated back into our culture and our knowledge of things.
Will there be an online version?
There is an electronic version, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we put all of our books out in EPUB as well, and Kindle, and all the various platforms. So, well, thank you both for taking this time to join this discussion, and I thank the audience as well. I will go ahead now and stop our recording and stop streaming.